Hey, good evening. How you doing?
I'm doing well. You go by Mike or Michael?
Michael.
Great, me too.
Great.
Nice to
I
meet you.
figured there's so many mics around that it's just easier going by Michael, I feel. So I've worked
Yeah,
with mics
well,
in like all my jobs, so I'm just like, I'll go by Michael. It makes it easier.
that makes sense. So where are you calling from?
Nashua, New Hampshire, actually. So
Okay.
yeah, but I grew up in Mass, I grew up in Methuen, and I've lived there for most of my life. So I'm very familiar with the Mass and the code. It's just that I moved to New Hampshire a couple years ago. So yeah,
Cool. I
happy to
like
be
your
here.
backdrop.
Thank you. Yeah.
It has a New Hampshire feel.
Yes. I know. I actually didn't know how to add one until just recently. So like I just found out how to do it today and then I put it in because we use Teams mainly. So I have this as a Teams background, but I haven't incorporated it into Zoom, but I'm glad I was able to figure it out.
Yeah, it looks definitely good. Well, thank you for
Great.
joining us tonight. It should be someone on the committee asked me how many people I was expecting, and I have no idea.
Yep. So
So have you and Chris been doing these things for other towns?
yes. Yeah. So I've done a handful of them thus far. So most communities want more of a presentation about what's in the specialized code, but it's interesting that your approach is to do both stretch and specialized. So we're happy to do that, but we just want to make sure there's no confusion when talking about them. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I think, the background, and we can jump in. What we're just trying to figure out is if we should bring it to town meeting, which is the end of April. And
yep,
so this is sort of, share the information ahead of time and get a pulse on, what people think. My sense
yep.
is, objectively speaking, if you're talking to current residents, unless they're planning on building a house, it's, there's not really an issue unless they're like, there's a knee jerk, I don't want to make things harder kind of thing, but
Mhm.
we'll find out. So,
Yeah, for sure. And it's something where on in particular, I mean, I know Shutesbury is a green community, meaning that the requirements of the stretch code are already the law of the land. So it's something
right.
where we'll just talk about that just to give an overview of like what's actually in it. But then when we go into the specifics, we can provide more details. So,
Yeah. And I think, my sense is most people don't know that fact,
yep. So,
that
yeah, so we can
it'll be
clear up
news.
any confusion. And I think the idea is for Chris to do the presentation on the specialized code where I'll cover the stuff in the stretch code because it's a little bit more complicated.
Oh, I have to admit everybody here. Sorry.
Great.
I,
Okay.
there we go. Hey, Gail.
Hey, Michael.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Have you
I'll
received
make it
any questions for tonight?
none.
Any
Yeah.
idea how many people will show up?
I have no idea. And hey Nate, hi Chris.
Hello.
So I want to apologize if you guys were hanging out in the waiting room. Michael and I were just chatting and I forgot to look. So
Oh, good. Okay.
So speaking of waiting room, tell me what I
Excellent.
need to do to let people in.
oh yeah, I need to make you a host is what I need to make you
Okay.
do. So
Hostess.
if you'd like, and you could be the mostess too. Okay. So you're a co-host. So if you click on participants
Yep.
on the bottom
Yep.
somewhere,
Invite.
it'll
No.
say on the bottom, it says participants is probably under the three dots.
Enable waiting room, hide profile, play sound, allow
No,
participants.
well, if you go on the bottom of the
Oh,
screen, right? Where it's like share screen and all those things. Are you on the bottom of your Zoom screen?
yes. Notes.
So,
Raise
so
hand apps.
yeah,
Start
so
screen. Share
click on
screen.
more. If the three dots for more,
Pause recording, stop recording, breakout rooms.
you don't have participants?
I have participants, yes.
Yeah, so click on participants.
Yeah.
And then you should get a right-hand screen sidebar.
Yeah, so well, it's in the middle, but yeah.
Yeah, so when people show up, there'll be a blue button that says admit, and all you have to do is admit them. So you'll see the list of people, and so the people in the meeting will be on the bottom, and the people waiting to be admitted will be on top.
It'll be at the top and I'll have an option to, okay. So
Yeah.
invite in this box doesn't have anything to do with this?
No,
Okay. Okay,
cool, great. And so, Chris, Michael and I were just going over stuff, and I mean, I think we covered everything in the email, but basically I'll invite everybody and orient them, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Nate just to sort of like set the stage and then introduce you guys, if that makes sense. And
Mhm.
it sounds like, from what Michael was saying, you guys have done this for a few towns already, so it's not new to you, even though it's new to us.
Yes, we've done it, but we haven't done it together yet. I'm looking forward to working with Michael.
Cool. Is there any heads up that you think we should have? I mean, you probably want to, do you have a presentation for sharing the screen? I'm assuming we have to make sure.
Yeah, I think I should try that just to make sure to see how it all looks when I try it. I'm gonna try sharing
Okay.
screen.
Great.
Let's see.
Try
which
one.
one?
And you should have the rights already.
Yep, I seem to.
Yay.
Great.
Cool.
Okay.
Awesome.
Terrific.
And now can I see? Can I scan through them? Yes. And you guys are seeing a move?
Yep.
Yeah, beautiful.
Excellent.
Great.
It works, it works.
Yeah, exactly. You don't
Always,
want to
right?
get tied up at the beginning of a meeting.
Exactly. Always helpful when that happens.
So Chris,
Gail, look,
oh, go ahead,
Gail,
sorry.
don't let anyone in for a couple of minutes, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Chris, so you can advance the slides. I'll just tell you when to advance when we get to my part of it. And I think we're gonna do it where you cover the first few slides, then we start talking about the stretch code. I'll take over, and then we'll draw the line of now we're talking about the specialized code, and I'll have you take it from there, as we discussed. So great.
Yep. Yeah, there's slides that'll make it obvious that this is now we're doing stretch code.
Yep.
It's
Okay.
gonna be short, it's gonna be, I think, right after the map, or maybe right after the three different, base specialized code. And yeah, you'll know when you
Yeah. Okay.
amen.
Sounds
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Cool. Nate, anything you want to share, chime in on?
I don't think so. My introduction will really be, I think, a minute and a half, 2 minutes. Yeah, I'll just,
Big talker.
set the stage, and hand it over to you, shortly thereafter. Is my plan. So.
Yeah, and I truly have no idea how many people are going to show up. I think you got, what's your sense, like half hour?
Yeah, the slideshow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although, yeah, I have to just make sure I don't go on too long.
Yeah,
Should be able to do it for half hour.
yeah, my sense is,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable time to get everything done.
yeah, and I would just say, don't feel rushed. Like, it
Okay.
seems like the two things to avoid, in my opinion, is like rushing through everyone, and then people feel like they sort of got rushed through the presentation, they didn't have a chance to absorb it. And then on the other hand, having too little time for Q&A. But I don't think, we got an hour and a half. I think we'll be fine. If
Okay.
you went 40 minutes, we still got another,
Okay.
50
Yeah.
minutes of questions and answers. And I haven't seen Isaac pop up yet, so I'm assuming between Isaac and Nate, you guys will identify stuff. One thing, I have a question, Gail, for you and Nate. It seemed like maybe I don't know if and how we should do this, but we're doing this one to inform and also to gauge people's tolerance, interest, or whatever, and
Yep.
bring it to town meeting. I don't know if it's a setup to ask that question, because this could probably be a range. But on the other hand, if we don't ask the question, we're just going to be guessing. So I'm not quite sure if you guys have thoughts about.
It did occur to me to compare the list of participant names tonight with folks who showed up on the survey.
Huh?
As,
How many people did the survey?
oh, I've forgotten.
Yeah.
Lots. My guess is that there won't be many people here tonight because it's really going to be for folks who are considering either new construction or major renovation. And I don't see that as a big scene in Shutesbury, but I could be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling Michael before you guys showed up that, it, it sort of doesn't, people might want to have the information, but to your point, if you're just a current resident and you live here and you're not doing any substantial work, it's, it might not be a big deal.
But they'll be
Um,
asked to vote at town meeting if we bring it forth, so
That is true. We want them to,
we should have an
Yeah.
informed public.
yes, exactly. Cool.
Yeah, to your question, Michael, is it a good idea to just come out and ask kind of how people are thinking about the information that's been provided and whether, an opt-in vote, how that sounds to folks. It might be possible to kind of take the temperature of the audience just from questions that folks ask, or I'm not sure. There may be more than one way to kind of glean that
Yeah.
insight.
Yeah, the way you just said it is good. It's sort of indirect, which is how you're feeling about this information. Yeah,
You might ask for suggestions if there's another way to follow up on this, if anybody has an idea on how to follow up on this. And if
we
anybody
could
answers
follow-
it, they're interested in some way.
we could say, hey, let's follow up at town meeting. What do you think? Cool. Well, I'm gonna let people in if that's good, and I think we'll just we'll give them a few minutes to show up, and then we'll go from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're doing that now, Michael?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll do it right this second because I'm staring at it. But once I start talking, if you can put your eyeballs on it, that'd be great.
Do you know if Nate, Isaac is planning to come?
I hope so.
Nate, I think I like your t-shirt. Are those wind turbines? Ah, a whole bunch of those.
Good catch.
That's really funny.
Okay, so next meeting, we have to have solar panels on our shirts, right?
They're harder to depict.
Yeah.
They just
And
look
you
like
guys,
rectangles.
and you guys have to come up with a t-shirt that somehow depicts like building codes. Thank you, Nate. You laughed. So, Mark, Mary, Melissa, Greg, we're just waiting for some other people to pop in. So we're going to give it a couple of minutes and then we'll proceed. We'll see how large of a crowd we have.
This is probably some kind of a no-no, but my wife does graphic arts and she's got a canvas bag that's got wind turbines and sheep on it. Another one that's got solar panels. If anybody's ever looking for those, we got them, they're available.
That's great.
Green Communities merch.
Right.
Right.
Well, I will say we'll give it another minute or two. Go from there. Okie dokie. Yeah, Nate, you think we should start? Or you think we should give it a couple more minutes?
be just another minute or two.
Cool. Okay, well, why don't we start? And we can respect the time of people who showed up at the beginning, and if we have a couple of people join us. But so I think folks who are in the audience know me, but I am Michael De Chiara, and I'm chair of the Energy and Climate Action Committee, or ECAC, as it's referred to in town. I want to welcome you all tonight. We're doing a special presentation on building codes and the developments of the last year and the possibilities for Shutesbury. So we want to take this opportunity to provide information so that people know what has occurred and what may occur, and create opportunity for questions. So without getting into it, I'm going to hand it over to Nate Hurd, who's really been sort of the lead on bringing this forward in ECAC. And Nate, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'm Nate Hurd, and I think I can just start by saying that Massachusetts updates its building codes every few years. And one of the reasons that the Energy and Climate Action Committee has been interested in this topic is that the way buildings are constructed affects how much money people have to spend on energy to heat those spaces, and also the greenhouse gases produced to power them. A lot of our climate goals, including the Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan, use the year 2050 as a target. And 2050 can sound like a really long time from now, but it's sobering to consider that a new home that's built today could last 100 years, or to the year 2124. So the way we build today really matters for our energy and climate future. So we're very fortunate to have with us this evening two people who can help walk us through what recent changes to building codes mean for Shutesbury, and what we might be able to do to help steer Shutesbury toward a cleaner and greener future by leveraging those code changes. So here to present on this topic are Chris Mason from the Department of Energy Resources. Chris is our regional coordinator within the Green Communities Division. And we also have Michael Rossi, who is an energy code specialist with PSD. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm going to hand it over to you. And when your presentation concludes, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers from the people who have joined us this evening. Thank you, and please take it away.
All right, I'm going to start by sharing a screen. Everybody should be able to see that. Splash plate. And okay, so first of all, thank you very much for having us. It's a really good thing to exactly what you're doing, get the information out there, let the community know what is going on and what options they have to move in different directions if they would like to. Today we're going to go over, put this in context a little bit, just why the building codes are moving the way they are. We're going to review what's called the Stretch Energy Code and HERS rating, and that is currently the code that Shutesbury is performing under. You've already adopted the Stretch Energy Code, which rides on top of the base code. And then we're going to give an overview of the specialized opt-in code, which Shutesbury, if they chose to, could also adopt, that would then ride on top of the Stretch code. This is all stemming from, as Nate was implying, the Climate Act of 2021, where it set a goal for Massachusetts to be have net zero emissions by 2050. It all started back in 2008 with the Global Warming Solutions Act, but the Climate Act was updated in 2021. A few interim goals of 2030 and 2040, but the big one is net zero emissions by 2050. There are estimates that say in 2050, about 27% of our buildings will have been built since 2023. So we're gonna, more than a quarter of our buildings are going to be built over the time between now and 2050. And there's reasons to the stretch code. When you're building a building, that is the easiest time to actually build in energy efficiency, put in the systems that allow you then to put in whether it's going to be an electric vehicle later on, solar panels later on. Do it when you build the house. It's much easier than trying to go back and retrofit it later on. On top of that, the building codes, the stretch energy code, as it increases demand for things such as heat pumps, a rapidly changing technology, it makes them more common and more available and more cost effective for even current homes that are going to adopt it. So there's a number of reasons to do this. The primary tactic or strategy that the state is using to do this is they're shifting different kinds of fuels, whether it's transportation fuels or home fuels, but shifting them from burning fossil fuels on site to an electric model. And right now you can see that the most efficient way to burn fossil fuels on site is a gas stove, or gas furnace. And to produce 1 million BTUs of heat, it would produce 120 units of greenhouse gas emissions. So right now, with a cold climate electric heat pump, which is what you kind of mean directed towards, you would produce about 45% less climate emissions. You'd be down to 65. And if you actually got your heat from the ground using a heat pump, you're down to 45. And that's with today's electric grid. So if we jumped at what we want to have happen by 2050, the electric grid, with the houses doing nothing else, they would their emissions would drop down to 18% or 18 units or 13 units with heat pumps. 85% drop over burning fossil fuels in the house. Yeah. If anybody has clarification questions, go ahead. Other than that, we'll wait for questions till the end. So as we're electrifying our transportation systems and electrifying our heating and cooling systems in our houses, the state is working very hard to get our electric grid to be cleaner and cleaner, reduce the number of greenhouse gases coming out of it. There's a chart of kind of showing what they're aiming for. So right now, we're talking about the codes piece. There are 3 codes in Massachusetts, you could say. One is the base code. Everybody really has the base code, is under the base code. But on around 230 communities, there's 270 and plus the 31 over here. But 300 communities have adopted the stretch code. So they've got some energy efficiency measures that are above the base code. And then the specialized code, there's 31 communities that have already adopted that. And that's just a few more things that are added on top of the stretch code. Here's a map of who's adopted what. The kind of whitish colored towns are the base energy code. The light blue are the stretch energy code. They've adopted the stretch energy code. And the darker blue have adopted the specialized energy code. Okay, stretch energy code is the current code in Shutesbury, and I'm going to pass this on to Mike Rossi to go over. Now, I want to stress that what we have found that because a number of changes came out relatively in the same time frame, there's a lot of confusion out there over which code you're talking about and what's actually what are you actually living under right now, and what might you be able to vote on at a town meeting? We're going to try to really make that line distinct so you can see it. So Mike Rossi is going to be talking about the current code. This is what you've already adopted. And then he's going to toss it back to me, and I'm going to go over the little changes that adopting the specialized code would have we'll run that way. So Michael.
Yes, thanks so much, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Michael Rossi. I'm an energy code specialist with PSD. And I want to preface it by saying, so the way I like to think about the codes is that you have the base code, and then the stretch code is essentially the base code plus additional efficiency requirements. And then on top of that, the specialized code is essentially the base code plus the stretch code plus a couple additional measures on top of that. So each of them sort of build off each other. And the code requirements just sort of the stretch and the specialized code create a couple provisions that increase the efficiency of the provisions in the code. So thanks, Chris. So for a little bit of a timeline on what's happening right now with the stretch code. So the stretch code in the state took effect for residential buildings on January 1st of last year for 2023. The provisions for the commercial code took effect in July 1st of 2023. And that requirement that is in the residential code that was provided initially was a HERS index, which we'll talk about in more detail in the coming slides, requirement of a 52. That requirement in July 1st of 2024 is actually going to be dropping significantly from a HERS 52 to a HERS 42 and 45. And then the next few slides will explain what that means. On this timeline too, I just want to say that the specialized code became available for adoption in January 1st of 2023 as well. So that so as of now, as Chris mentioned, 31 states have adopted, or 31 communities have adopted it. And so it's been available for adoption for a little bit. All right, so first I'll talk a little bit about what HERS is and what in the HERS process. So a HERS rating is a home energy rating system, which is essentially a third-party inspection done that's certified through the Residential Energy Services Network, or ResNet. And the way I like to describe a HERS rating is think of it like a miles per gallon sticker for a car, but for a house. So what it involves is preliminary modeling of a home based on plans. So the HERS rater is hired by the builder or consultant or someone on site to conduct to do some inspections. So first what happens is the builder provides the HERS rater with a set of plans and says, I'm going to build like this. So the HERS rater takes those plans and builds a preliminary model. And that preliminary model is used to obtain a building permit at the beginning of the construction process. And then the intent is just to say, based on all of these features that were provided by by our client, who's the builder, they say they're going to build with this type of water heater, this efficiency insulation, this level of efficiency, like mechanical equipment, ventilation. They sort of describe how they're going to build the home provided to the HERS rater. And the HERS rater puts together that preliminary thing that's used for the building permit. But then part of that is also verifying that the information that was provided at the preliminary inspection was accurate. And what that requires is a what's described as a midpoint inspection, where the rater will go in the field after insulation is installed, but before drywall is put on, to make sure that the insulation was installed correctly. And they have different models of how well the insulation is installed. They also collect weak features about different aspects of the home, like the efficiency of the windows, as I said, the mechanical equipment, the other features in the home. And there's a lot that goes into it. So essentially it's a pretty comprehensive model that takes into consideration a lot of features of the building, like how big it is, like the floor area and the volume. It looks at the appliances that are used, the mechanical equipment, the ventilation, the insulation type, R value, which is like the thermal resistance, the efficiency of the windows, the appliances that are used, and solar PV as just some aspects that are into it, but it's a pretty comprehensive design. So there's a lot more that's included in that. And that's used to build that final energy model. So after the preliminary inspection and that midpoint inspection, there's also a final inspection where essentially the rater would go on site and use equipment like the one shown here, which is a blower door, to test how airtight the building is. So what that door does is essentially like it's a fan that sucks all of the air out of the house and depressurizes it. And by depressurizing it, you can understand how much air leakage is coming through different components of the building because all the air has to go through that fan. So when you're in a home that has a blower door, you can sort of feel if there's an air leak somewhere. Common areas of air leak might be attic, like hatches around floor sweeps to the basement, if it's not intentionally heated or unconditioned space, and things like that. So essentially the HERS rater goes on site at the final inspection and does that blower door test. If it's a duct system, they'll test the air tightness of the ducts, and they'll also go on site to verify how well the mechanical ventilation system was installed as well. And then after they collect all of that data, they produce a final HERS certificate that's provided to the local building official saying, we initially gave you a projected HERS rating that's saying what we anticipate the house will be built to. But now we verified all of the features that we put in that initial report or have changed anything based on things that have changed along the project. Here's our final report with everything that is basically how every feature we put in the building, we verified that it's built to this way, essentially. And the reason I talk about the HERS process is because it's actually been embedded in the Massachusetts Code for a while now, I believe since 2008 when the stretch code was initially developed. And we'll talk more about what the scores mean in the next slide, I believe.
Right. I just want to say, so just to kind of, the point you could say you were making at the end there was that not only is the house designed to be energy efficiency, it's tested. So that
Correct.
you know
Yep.
it's efficient. You know, you got what you paid for.
Yes, absolutely. So the rater is there to ensure that all of the features of the home are done accurately. So yeah, so now on the right here, we have that HERS index column, and that's sort of showing what the HERS score means. So the spec home is a HERS 100, and I should preface it by saying the lower the score, the more efficient. The HERS 100 is equivalent to a new home that was constructed in 2006, and the average HERS rating in Massachusetts in 2020 and 2021 was a HERS 51. Most existing homes fall around the HERS 140 range, just because they're older. So they're built prior to 2006, so they're going to have an increase in score. And a zero net energy home would be described as a HERS 0 or below. You could actually also have negative HERS index is. So essentially, the requirements of the code have steadily decreased over time. And by decreased, I mean the decrease in HERS rating index, but also increase in efficiency. And so in 2009, the code was a 65 for the stretch code or a 75 for the base code. Now in 2020, they were actually the same, with the base code and the stretch code both being a 55. In 2023, the base code stayed at a 55, but the stretch code requirement dropped to a 52. And the specialized code is a 42. But in 2024, the base code is going to drop to a HERS 52. The stretch code is going to be a 42, and the specialized code is also going to be a 42. So the requirements of this stretch code, which you guys are currently on, and the specialized opt-in code are going to remain the same in July when that requirement changes.
Next slide.
Yes, please. Thank you.
No,
All right.
slide.
So yeah, so first off, we'll talk about some of the changes that happened in the new stretch code compared to the one that was available previously. So I talked a little bit about the HERS index reduction. So the number significantly decreased from the prior code cycle. There's also new ventilation requirements where previously you could use an exhaust-only ventilation system like a bathroom exhaust fan to provide whole house continuous mechanical ventilation. But that requirement's now changed, where now you have to use either an energy recovery ventilator or ERV or heat recovery ventilator HRV to provide ventilation for the home, which is essentially a balance system which brings fresh air into the home while also exhausting stale air out of the home. There's also some new requirements for electric vehicle readiness. So what that is essentially pre-wiring for the future installation of an electric vehicle charger. In addition, there's a couple changes in the pathways that someone can use to comply with a code. There was an added pathway for passive house design, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail as well. And there was a pathway that was used previously, which was Energy Star version 3.1, which was removed and is no longer an option for compliance in the new stretch code. And then additionally, there's also requirements for existing building upgrades, where large additions and level 3 alterations over 1,000 square feet or exceeding 100% of the total conditioned floor area also have to follow some of the requirements of the code. All right, so as I said, I kind of talked about this in a little bit more detail. So there's in January, the requirement for the HERS index changed from a 55 to a 52 of 2023. In July of 2024, that HERS index for the stretch code is going to drop to a 45 if the home's all electric, or a 42 if you're using mixed fuels. So if any combustion equipment is used in the home for heating, cooling, or heating, cooling, water heating, or cooking. There's also EV ready wiring requirements that I discussed, which is one 240 volt, 50 amp circuit per home. And then we talked about the ventilation requirements and the different pathways. So I talked about this a little bit in the last slide, but for large additions and alterations, the HERS requirement for additions is going to be in the range of a 52 to a 58, depending on the sources of energy that are used in the home. And the existing buildings that are required to use a HERS rating are those that exceed 1,000 square feet of an addition or 100% of the existing conditioned floor area, which is like intentionally heated space, is altered. All right, next slide, please.
Gail, do you have a clarification question?
Yes, it seems odd in July 2024 that the HERS is 45 for all electric and more efficient for mixed fuel. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, so the requirement for that is that the mixed fuel, so as I said, the lower the HERS index, the more stringent the requirement is. So if you are going to be building all electric, the code gives you a little bit of flexibility in the required HERS index in order to do that. So essentially, it's to some degree could be considered a penalty for using fossil fuels because you have to meet the requirements a little bit more. And essentially what the HERS index is it provides flexibility and trade-offs and like what kinds of things you can do to meet the requirements of the code. So there historically has been a prescriptive path, which is essentially like you have to have this level insulation, you have to have this level efficiency of equipment, you have to meet all of these requirements. And it's like a checklist of measures. But what the HERS rating is essentially a performance path, which is a little bit more flexible. So it says you can have less efficient windows if you have more efficient insulation. You can have, and you can sort of design it in a way that could meet the code. And it's sort of based on the performance of the home rather than just meeting all of these checklist measures. And so because of that, the performance path is what's required by the code. So essentially what it says is that if you're building all electric, you have a 3-point HERS index buffer to help you do it. And it sort of incentivizes that all electric building. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So there are a lot of really great incentives out there for builders and developers as well relating to some of the requirements here. So the all electric homes are generally cheaper to build. And the reason being for that is that you can have a heat pump system, which provides both heating and cooling that replaces two separate systems, which might be a central AC and a furnace. So essentially by using heat pumps to replace two, you're spending your money on one system instead of two different systems. Massive also provides a lot of really great incentives for all electric homes. So there are stringent requirements that go along with how to do that, but essentially you get a $15,000 incentive for achieving a HERS 45 for a single family, and you get a $25,000 incentive if you achieve a HERS 35 or a passive house single family home. And there are additional requirements that are required for that. It's not just the HERS index. There's also other measures you have to do, but that's giving a snapshot of like how the code sort of aligns with some of these incentives that are available. For multifamily buildings, Mass Save also provides a $3,000 per unit design study funding, just to say if it's feasible to achieve that passive house standard. And then additionally, there's some incentives that are provided from the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, which provides 2,500 or $5,000 per home from the 45L tax credit, which is essentially a you have to get a certification for the Department of Energy Zero Energy Ready Homes program or Passive House. And that's pretty aligned with the HERS index. Like the requirements to meet that program are similar to the HERS requirements that are noted for the Mass Code. And then for multifamily buildings, you have this 179D tax credit, which provides incentives for commercial and multifamily buildings up to $6 per square foot of the project. So there's a lot of really great incentives out there to do this when you're looking at new construction. All right,
Yeah,
next
you
slide,
say-
please.
This is the first time that Mass Save has offered an incentive, if you meet building code. In the past, you always had to exceed it. Now you just have to meet it for that 15,000. Okay,
Great. Yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris now. So I spoke a lot about what's in the stretch code, which is, as I said, something that the Shutesbury is already following as being part of the Green Communities program. And now what Chris is going to talk about is the additional requirements that are on top of the current requirements if you want to opt into this new program. So I'll turn it back over to Chris. Thanks.
thank you, Mike. Yep. One of the reasons we're changing presenters here is just, again, to be really clear. Mike was talking about what you already have, and I'm going to be talking about what you might want to adopt. So residential, low rise, and multifamily. And this is describing differences from stretch code. Okay, this slide right here, I think sums it up pretty well. If you're building an all-electric new home of any size, and the town adopts a specialized code, there'll be no change. It's the same under both cases. If you're building a mixed fuel home, as Mike described, that's a home that has some kind of on-site burning of fossil fuels, whether it's your boiler or gas stove, gas dryer, gas hot water heater. Then depending on the square foot, first of all, you need to meet a HERS 42 for a mixed fuel home, as Mike described before. That's for the stretch code. But then you need to add in a wiring for electrification. So if, say, you have a gas stove, you need to have a circuit run to that gas stove so that someone in the future doesn't have to pay a huge expense to add wiring in just to swap that stove out to an electric stove, for an example, or the same thing with a water heater. And then you also need to have a certain amount of PV if you've got the sunlight for it. So assuming you have the sunlight, if you're building under 4,000 square feet, you need to put a minimum of 4 kilowatts of solar on the house. If it's over 4,000 square feet, you need to put enough solar on it for it to be considered net zero. So that solar would have to produce enough electricity over the course of a year that it would cover the amount of electricity you need for the heating the home for a year. So it makes it net zero. You also could go through the passive house option. That's another pathway. And that one, believe that one probably, Mike, that probably calls for solar already.
It does not, but there might be specific program requirements that could use it. So I don't know if I'm not as familiar with the Passive House program requirements, but I don't know if solar is required as is, but there might be in there.
Right.
I'd have to check the specific program.
And then wiring for electrification. Right. And home additions and alterations. Again, the specialized code won't make any difference. The stretch code has already got the changes built in, so this stays the same. And then historic or existing homes, you can get exemptions for that. So solar PV sizing, just to give you an idea. So if in mixed fuel, less than 4,000 square feet, 4 kilowatts, and mixed fuel, 4,000 square feet plus, enough for net zero, which is roughly 8 kilowatts or so. And actually, you know, I'm misrepresenting something here. And I was wondering as I was saying this, it doesn't require the solar. All electric buildings, I'm sorry, yes, for mixed fuel it does. All electric buildings, solar is not required, but it is required that you have the conduits run. Not even the wiring, but the conduits. You have to, so that you can put solar in without having to pull the walls apart, or run wires down the outside of your house. And as it says here, mixed fuel buildings, solar required when there is a suitable solar roof zone of 300 square feet or greater. So if your house is in the woods, you don't want to cut down a bunch of trees, you don't have to. You guys asked us to stick mostly with residential because I think that's what Shutesbury is predominantly concerned about. But you did say to kind of touch upon commercial and multifamily. So that's what I'm doing right here. So multifamily, the specialized code basically just kind of narrows the pathway for an all-electric house. So you have to go from what's known as a Teddy, which I won't get into unless you're really interested in commercial. First 45, so it narrows you down to the passive house pathway. And then once again, with mixed fuel, it adds in wiring for electrification. That's the only change. For commercial buildings, again, if it's all electric, the requirements stay the same. Specialized code doesn't affect anything. For the mixed fuel, once again, you have to have the solar PV and wired for electrification. And for other commercials, because that was schools, office, municipal buildings. For other commercial, it's basically the same thing. If it's all electric, there's really no change. Mixed fuel, and you have to add solar and wiring for electrification. So a little bit on specialized code adoption process and timeline, which we can come back to or go into that more if you want to. It's in the slide deck. And I think I'm going to just pass it back to Mike for the general frequently asked questions and to kind of wrap up for this.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Chris. So here's some frequently asked questions we typically get about the code. And I'll just run through it really quickly. So does the opt-in specialized code apply to existing structures? And the answer is no. Improvements to existing structures, depending on size, are regulated by the updated stretch code and the base code. And next question is, will the opt-in specialized code discourage the creation of affordable housing? The answer is no. Also, the incentives will continue to encourage affordable housing, while the opt-in specialized code delivers benefits to the residents. And another question we get a lot is it possible to install a gas cooktop? And the answer is yes, and that's permitted under the mixed fuel pathway. And when asked why adopt the opt-in specialized code, the number one reason is that pre-wiring requirement, which essentially avoids costly retrofits down the road and expedites electrification. So when I think about this, I like to think about the fact that when you have a home, when you're on the early stages, building a new home, it's much easier to run wiring and things like that when the drywall isn't installed yet and the home is open. Because when the drywall is installed, then you have to drill new holes, and it's costlier to get the project done. So essentially, if you have to retrofit it down the line, it might be a lot more costly than it would be to do up front when the house is open, when you can run the wires without it impacting any drywall or something. And another question we get is, why does the opt-in specialized code permit fossil fuels? And the answer is it preserves market choice at a time when utility pricing is really volatile. Utility costs can vary 300% among mass communities. And there are also definitions of net zero that vary pretty wildly. And one thing I also wanted to get to here that we didn't really cover in the presentation is like what passive house is. And I think now might be a good time to just talk about that in a little bit more detail. But first, I just want to talk about, or we can go back to the last slide. So the last slide just shows some of the resources.
Sorry.
Yep, no worries. Where you can find more information. And those resources are available and can be shared from the presenters afterwards. But when it comes to passive house, so when I describe the code requirements, one path is the energy rating index path, which is the HERS rating stuff that we talked about. But another completely separate option for compliance with the stretch code is passive house. And what passive house is essentially, think of it like top of the line type construction where you have buildings that are really, really energy efficient in that they have a lot of insulation, and they really fundamentally show the impacts of building science principles, meaning that it has amazing indoor air quality. You use very highly efficient windows like triple pane windows. You're going to be using heat pumps, and reducing the loads of the house, the heating and cooling loads, with a combination of all these factors, like really being very airtight, and that's with the added insulation, having high efficiency windows and other mechanics there. And what Passive House is essentially, it's also a third-party certification program similar to HERS, but there's two options. There's FIAS, which is formerly known as the Passive House Institute United States, which is the US model essentially for Passive House design. And the requirements for that path is achieving a FIAS Core 2021 certification or a FIAS Zero 2021 certification. And I love this picture too, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a sec. But
So you can
the
see
other,
this? Okay.
yes, thanks, Chris. So the other certification type out there is PHI, which is Passive House Institute, which is essentially another certification program, but that's the European standard. So you can either use the US standard or the European standard, and that's what the two options are there. And you just have to have a third-party verifier similar to a HERS rater, but more of a passive house consultant to rate the home to determine if it meets the requirements of the passive house project. So as the slide shows, passive house is an approved pathway in the new code. So stretch code, it's an optional pathway for both residential and commercial buildings to meet the code, and is an alternative to the HERS or TEDI pathways. As Chris said, TEDI is really complicated. What it stands for is thermal energy demand intensity. And it essentially sets like limits for commercial buildings of like what you have to meet for a heating load and a cooling load. And but it really takes an engineer or a really like in the weeds design professional to really get what the TEDI requirements are. So typically we're not going to dive into that in too much detail. And then the other thing with Passive House is as noted with the opt-in code, it's also a requirement for multifamily residential buildings over 12,000 square feet, and is an optional compliance pathway for other pathway or for other types of buildings. As you can see here, passive house buildings can be any building of any size, residential buildings, townhouses, multifamily buildings. It doesn't require all electric or net zero, but it does provide a pathway to get there. So yeah, passive house, even though it says house, it does apply to all different types. And then if you go to the next slide, please, Chris. Yeah, so I really like this picture because it really shows the thermal energy usage of this row of townhouses right here, with the thermal camera. So the passive house is the one that's shown that stands out in blue. And the reason being is because there's a lot less energy that's being leaked out of the house compared to the adjacent units. So the passive house is a lot more airtight, so you're not going to see as much energy going through the building envelope. And by having less energy go through, it's going to be more efficient. All right, so I think that's all we can cover there, just to give a little bit update there. But yeah, so now I guess we'll open it up to questions, and I'll turn it back to Chris or Michael. Thank you.
Well, I think before we wrap up, if Chris, you just want to go over the process slide that you showed, because I think that might give
Sure.
some context. Whether or not we go there, it'd be good to have some information. And
Is this large enough for people to see?
if you can make it bigger, that'd be great. Just
Let me,
click on-
give me a moment then.
Okay. And if not, that's fine, the other way.
Yeah, I'm hoping this won't take that long. I'm actually kind of baffled at what happened here when I got to the
Then
end.
you just have to go into the slide presentation mode, and then it'll get bigger.
Well, I have it on my screen as, here we go. Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Ta-da!
Yay.
Okay. Right, okay, so it needs to, it needs to be put on a warrant article and be voted on by town meeting. It's a town meeting bylaw. Um, um, you know, just like any other bylaw, published in state register, I guess. Town meeting, in this case, town meeting votes. And
Yes.
you set in the bylaw, you set the effective date that you want. It's up to you, but it's highly recommended. DOE highly recommends that you give it at least 6 months. So there's a 6-month window before it goes into effect. And I basically require it to be either be January 1st or July 1st. So that builders don't have to have, codes just changing willy-nilly here or there throughout the year. They know that there might be a change in January 1st or July 1st. And as it says, recommend 6 to 12 months between when the vote happens in town meeting and it actually goes into effect. But other than that, it's basically adopting a warrant article.
And Chris, is it a general bylaw or a zoning bylaw?
I think it's a general bylaw.
Mhm.
Okay.
That's what
Yeah, and I
was-
believe there is a template for what the bylaw could look like at the DOER's website as well. So there's a template of what you could use for it that's
Great.
available too.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Well, I think we'll shift into Q&A, but I want to thank both of you for this information. It was, I thought, clear and very helpful. Gail, looks like you got a question out of the gate.
Yes, on one of the slides that Michael Rossi showed, that this next iteration, both the stretch code and the specialized code would be with a HERS 42. So if there's not a difference, why would we elect to adopt? Yeah, thank you. Why would we adopt?
So the specialized code would still have the requirements for pre-wiring, for electrification, and the requirements for the photovoltaics, for the solar electric. Other than that, they would basically be the same at that point.
Mhm.
Whereas if you were under just the stretch code, you don't have those added requirements. Even though the HERS
that's
rate
correct.
is still the same. Yeah.
Yep. So essentially what it is adding what Chris said. He covered that really well.
Great. So I'm wondering, Mark or Craig or Melissa, do you all have any questions you want to ask? It's looking, oh, Mark, you got a question?
No, I'm just saying I'm quite a very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, I have a question to ask, because I and you can correct me if it doesn't quite apply here. I live in a very tight house. It was built in 1998. Probably would have a very low HERS score. And I've been told by many furnace people that my house is too tight and unhealthy because it doesn't leak enough. And we essentially have to leave a window open to let the passive air come in. How do these regulations help with keeping a house healthy? Because you do have to have a passive influx of air into
Yeah,
it.
I'm happy to speak to that a bit. So I think there is a myth out there that we're building houses too tight, and that the house needs to breathe. But the way I've heard it said is that the house doesn't need to breathe, the occupant does. And what that means is that the ventilation system that you have in a tight house like that has to be enough in order to meet it. So building science is pretty complicated, but part of it is that every aspect of the home has to connect to another part of it.
Right.
So if the building's too tight, but you don't have a properly functioning mechanical ventilation system, then you might have some of these mold and mildew issues that develop because of condensation. Because if you have an airtight house with improper ventilation, that might not help with it. So I guess the way I like to describe it is that the code requirement here is to have this ERV or HRV available that provide balanced ventilation, meaning the amount of air that's brought into the house is similar to the amount of air that's exhausted out of the house. And that provides a pretty good mechanical ventilation system that can help improve indoor air quality that might be associated with that tight envelope. So it's all about working together. So the mechanical ventilation system has to work together with the envelope in order to achieve the best results. Thanks.
Melissa, I would add to that one of the downsides of a house that you would call leaky is that the air moves through the house wherever it can find a pathway. It's not a controlled pathway. And when humid air moves through a house, it often will condense. And so you can find parts of the house where, as the air is moving through, it actually causes moisture buildup, which could then cause mold and other irritants and degrade your air quality. Whereas if in this case you have heat or energy recovery ventilation is required, then as Michael said, you're moving air out, and then when the air comes in, you're actually going to take the heat out of the air that's going out, and you're going to put it in the heat coming in. So you don't have the energy loss of having air moving through your house, because you're actually grabbing the energy, but you are sizing the ventilation system to provide you with plenty of good fresh air.
Yeah, that's the an air exchanger is something that my house had. It is something that they had mentioned for it, although they put I have forced hot air furnace, and they put a condensate pump on it, so it took most of the moisture out of the air. So I wasn't moving it around the house that way. But it is just something that I've been told many times that the house is too tight. If you could smell dinner the night you come home from work from the night before, that the house doesn't have enough breathing, right? So and then the other question I had was, we live in a community where we lose our lights, and having a propane cooktop is something that is helpful in those times where you don't have electricity to cook or such. And so that would fall underneath the mixed fuel house, making new construction required to have all the wiring. If a person is building a house and they can't afford the extra making the house ready for the solar panels and stuff, is there a waiver that can happen if it's a low income person building a house or building that can't afford to add that stuff into their home?
So I would if when you buy a house, you don't buy a house with cash, you buy it through financing. And so if the monthly expenditures, your finance cost and your energy bills, those combined are low, whichever house provides a lower level of combined mortgage cost and energy cost is going to be more affordable to live in. And that tends to be these high efficiency houses. The energy costs go down enough that the monthly mortgage costs don't kick in. If there's it's a very slight amount of increased expense to build the house with the electric, with the gas stove in it, and the wiring to run for it is pretty nominal. You're just running one line, from your electric panel. Make sure you have a big enough panel. Running one line of the electric panel to where the gas range currently is. Mike, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I'd also add that when it comes to mixed fuel, this is something we just didn't touch on, but a fossil fuel backup generator is also allowed. Just so when looking at the mixed fuel, that's also an option. And so if you use a fossil fuel backup generator, that doesn't put you under the mixed fuel pathway. Even if it's an all electric pathway, you can still use that backup generator. And yeah, I think when it comes down to it, there's as Chris mentioned, he's talked about the lower monthly energy bills that you're going to get from some of these high efficiency houses. But the other flip side of it too is a lot of the health benefits that'll come from building a home to code. There's a lot of health and safety benefits through improved indoor air quality that come about by building a high efficiency home that's new construction. And yeah, so that's that's what we have.
Cool. I'm gonna jump in just with a follow-up question. I know Nate had one, but do you all have, just looking at this information, since we're a green community, we're already, bought into the stretch code. So is there any available information about the average difference in costs between the requirements for a stretch code versus specialized, to sort of get to Melissa's talking about if affordability is, I'm assuming that in many communities, affordability is sort of what rises to the top as an issue.
Yeah, that's correct. And I don't know up to this point if there have been any cost studies that are done between the stretch and the opt-in code. And that's because the opt-in code is so new that it's hard to, I don't know if any quantitative analysis has been done looking at the two side by side.
Okay. Thank you. Nate, you had a question?
I did, but it was very much along these lines, the cost of retrofitting being more expensive than, building in an energy efficient way in the first place, and then the relationship between, potential upfront costs versus the long-term cost of having a leaky house. So, I think Michael and Chris kind of have addressed some of these
Right.
questions I had.
Yeah, and when it comes to comparing the stretch code to the specialized code, most definitely what the specialized code is doing is it is making those changes in the future. It is making them cost effective, making them a lot cheaper. So you don't have to go, struggle through the choice of, okay, I want to make this change, but I gotta tear out the walls in order to put some wiring in, or snake wiring through my walls where it's already in there.
Yeah, and I
Well,
echo that. It's just easier to build up front than doing after the fact and having the retrofit costs that associate with the project. Thanks.
Mark, you had a question?
Yeah, question on, the new codes are proposing, to pre-wire for solar panels. Is there any commentary on the addition of batteries for storage?
So battery storage isn't included in the current code that Massachusetts has adopted. The latest edition of the National Model Code that's out for availability, the 2024 International Energy Conservation Code. So the codes are developed on the National Model Code. Every 3 years, they're updated by an organization called the International Code Council, or ICC. So ICC updates the codes every 3 years, and each new code version has new provisions that are associated with it. The battery storage in the energy code is just starting to take effect in that latest model code. So there are some readiness provisions in that new code that are available for battery storage, but that's not the code that Massachusetts has adopted yet. So I could see some readiness provisions coming into play in the Massachusetts code in the next few years, but as of now, it's not in it.
Doesn't mean you can't put batteries in yourself, though.
That's correct. Yep. It's just not required yet, is what I was getting at.
Great. And I want to just circle back. Melissa, I had a follow-up question. Are you thinking, in terms of affordability, do you think of it more as a concern for someone who's renovating or someone who's building new, or does it, or
Well, well, either, because if you think, if you think about what the person is taking out, a loan to build, either a house new or even an addition, they're watching every penny, because it's, I mean, I'm thinking in my case, if I did an addition and these things were going to cost me, $20,000 more to do, I would not want to do them, right? Because I want to do my addition at the most affordable rate for me and my family, right? Like, so I think that's kind of what I'm thinking. You're asking people to put things in their house that is adding cost to that construction, and that is a concern for some people. Like, if you're a contractor and you're building a house and you want to make it a sellable, these are great. But if you're on a somewhat fixed income, as far as you have only so much you can afford to put into a house, and you're going to you're gonna build that house to what you can afford, this may throw those into adding more than they would like. So I guess it's both really, Michael, because when you go to do something, you're looking at it. Now, this is also asking people to put stuff in their house for the next person who might want to put this stuff in. And they may not want that in their house, to be honest. I mean, it does force them to do something they may not want to do. I live in a very efficient house that was built, like I said, in 1998. My electric bill and my things come to me that tells me my house is more efficient than my neighbors, and my neighbors have solar panels and I don't, and my house is more efficient than theirs as far as electrical use, so it can be done without some of this stuff in it, so that's my concern,
Yeah.
people be forced to put extra things in the house that they won't necessarily can afford, especially with the cost of building things now and inflation, so
Thank you.
there is
Yeah, thanks for that question. I do think it does have merit and value for sure. When it comes to additions and the requirements there, it is only over a certain percentage that you have to do a HERS rating.
I understand.
So it's only if it's over 1,000 square feet, or if you're adding over 100% of the existing building area. So those are what we'd consider the larger additions. If it's a smaller addition, it's able to meet a prescriptive code requirement that's like 999 square feet or below. And what that is just having any new walls or equipment put into the space just have to meet the requirements for new construction and the prescriptive values that are provided with it. So it's like, it'll say you have to have this level efficiency insulation, and it'll give you like a checklist of things you have to do. So these added requirements are only for those larger additions that are out there and don't apply to smaller ones.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep, and I want to add on top of that the additions piece is already, that's what Shutesbury, that's what your code now has.
Mhm.
So if the town is going to be making a decision, it won't affect that whatsoever, because the specialized code doesn't address additions and alterations. It's you use it what you have in the stretch code. Your extra cost does come in if the specialized code requiring the PV array and the running of the wiring for any kind of mixed fuels. Yes, that would be an added cost, and you're correct. You're kind of sharing the cost with future owners. But the overall cost is going to be less because you're doing it in the most cost-effective time to do it. But that's a point. Yeah.
Chris, just on that last point, it seemed like with the solar panels from some previous slide that that's only for the bigger houses. So would it hold that if you're building an over 4,000 square foot house, that although everyone wants to save money, you're probably not in the same financial constraints?
So
I think it's the previous slide.
So if it's okay, right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it's all electric house, I'm actually going to go to this one because it says it right here. If it's an all electric building, then solar is not required. So just solar ready roofs. And what they mean by that is, structurally sound, it can hold a PV array. And you need to have identified a chase that you can run wires through at some point. So it's not that much, it's really not a lot. Well, that's what the cost would be if you're going for the specialized code. And the size of the code, the size of the house, it's the size of the PV array that it's asking you to meet. So 4 kilowatts or probably around 8 kilowatts plus, depending on the size of the house. So Melissa's, right, this is the stuff in green here is where there will be somewhat of an additional cost where you're actually sharing the cost with a future owner. Kind of assuming that at some point, fossil fuels are really going to be very hard to get and expensive. That's where the state's trying to push everything.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that a little bit, some of the requirements to get to net zero for homes over 4,000 square feet those are typically larger luxury homes where, again, costs aren't going to be as prohibitive as they would
Right.
be for smaller projects. So that's sort of why that's out there. And then in terms of sharing it with the next owner and stuff too, I mean, I think another thing to put this into context is that a new building is going to be around for theoretically 100 plus years. So what you're putting in now is sort of preparing for some of those changes that it's going to undergo over time. And building some of these more efficiency measures are so much easier to do upfront than they would be to do after the fact. And that is especially true for some of the insulation requirements and things like that. But some of this pre-wiring stuff that's in the code is great because it gets you to a point where 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, if you want to sell the house to someone new, you already have those in place for a future owner who might want it. If they don't want it, I mean, it's still available. That gives more options about if they can do it or not. So I think I was when thinking about this stuff, I put it into a perspective of like the length and the life cycle costs of the house itself.
One other issue, I think, sort of pulling back from just the homeowner, but, all communities in Massachusetts are, if not actually having conversations, having some consideration about affordable housing. And so, Michael, you had mentioned that this stuff is not a deterrent to affordable housing. I don't know if there's anything beyond what we're discussing now that relates to that topic in terms of affordable housing in these regs.
I can say I know Habitat for Humanity folks who are very pro stretch code and very pro specialized code because it's cost effective to live in the building. So affordable housing, it's more affordable to live in the house. That's more important in my mind than how much the house costs to buy, or to build at the beginning. It's how much does the house cost to live in? And a highly efficient house costs less to live in.
That's helpful. Thank you. Any other questions anyone's got? Okay. Well, I would say this was a really helpful session in terms of the information and the Q&A. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank both Chris and Michael for joining us tonight. All of our meetings in Shutesbury are recorded, so I think we're planning on posting this on the ECAC website so that people can see it. And then when we determine our next ECAC meeting, which sometime in March, we have yet to figure out that date. We'll probably circle back and figure out if this is a topic that we want to move forth to town meeting for consideration or not. But this, I think, definitely sets a good foundation for that conversation. So I wanted to thank both our presenters and then folks who joined us tonight for the conversation. If there's nothing else, I think we can wrap. Anyone else have any other thoughts before we take off? Great. Well, given that, why doesn't everyone have a wonderful evening? Gail
Thank you
and
for
Nate,
inviting
I'll
us.
see you.
Yeah, thanks for
Oh,
having us.
Thank you for being here. It was really
Thank you.
helpful.
Truly.
And Nate, thanks for being the conduit to getting this to happen. Appreciate it.
Thank
And,
you.
okay. Have a good night, everybody.
Yep.
night.
Thank you all.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Bye.